Welcome. Thank you for joining the Friends of the National World War II Memorial's monthly virtual education conference series. This is a series we started during the height of COVID to keep the dialogue going. We feature historians and authors, World War II veterans, and war orphans sharing their unique perspectives and memories and reflections on World War II. And so we're so glad that you can participate today and hopefully each month that we host this. For those who don't know, my name is Holly Rotundi, and I'm Executive Director of the Friends of the National World War II Memorial. The Friends of the World War II Memorial was founded by the folks who built the World War II Memorial right back here. And today our mission is teaching the lessons of yesterday to unite the generations of tomorrow. And we try to accomplish this through our commemorative programs at the World War II Memorial and our many educational programs that we host, including this program. We have an annual summer teachers conference. So any of those teachers who might be online, if you're interested in joining us this July, please let me know. I can send you the application, and I certainly hope you'll join us. It's a week-long immersive program here in DC at no cost to the teacher. So, but without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Friends resident historian, New York Times bestselling author Alex Kershaw. Alex?
We have a great lineup this morning. Thanks, Holly. I'm going to kick off very quickly by saying that our first guest is in the Utrecht, Samuel de Korte. He's written two books about World War II, one about the Dutch resistance, and the other, which he's going to talk about in some detail today, is about the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion, one of the lesser recognized units in the European theater. But critically, all of the non-commissioned officers, the actual officers in the field, and men in their battalion were actually black and were not recognized sufficiently at the time, did not receive the awards that they should have received. And without any further ado, here is Samuel to tell us all about that amazing American unit in the European theater.
Thank you all for joining me today in a presentation about the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion, also titled Fighting on Both Fronts. Before we get started, I'd like you all to imagine a place. It's a place in France, December 1944. A task force is assembled to seize a small village. The task force consists of a company of infantry, a platoon of tanks, and a platoon of tank destroyers. As they are approaching the target, they are engaged by the enemy. The first thing that the commander of the platoon of tank destroyers does is deploy two of his tank destroyers. It's the start of the Battle of Klimbach, and it's the moment when 3rd Platoon of C Company 614 Tank Destroyer Battalion would earn the Distinguished Unit Citation, and Charles L. Thomas, the commander of the platoon of tank destroyers, would earn the Medal of Honor. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the history of tanks and tank destroyers. I'm going to talk about the training and the preparation that the 614th had before going into combat. I'm going to talk about the Battle of Klimbach on 14 December 1944. And we're going to talk about the rest of the war that they spent in Europe. Lastly, I'm going to talk about the end of the tank destroyer battalions. The first tanks were deployed by the British in 1916 during the Battle of the Somme. Called water carriers or mobile water tanks, they were intended to fool the enemy about their true purpose. These tanks would support the infantry rather than be offensive weapons of war. The first tanks had a rather dismal performance. Some performed as intended, others broke down before reaching the starting line or broke down during the operations. However, these weapons changed the future of warfare. They could bring fearsome weapons to the battlefield on a mobile platform, and they could also cross terrain that would have been impassable to a common soldier. After Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, he envisioned a new Germany, And his new Germany needed a new type of soldier. A new doctrine and new weapons of war were made for these soldiers. The Germans improved upon the stormtrooper tactics that they had employed at the end of the First World War. One of the improvements that they made is that the mobility of a unit was centered around the mobility of a tank and not around the mobility of a common soldier. Furthermore, they started to create combined arms teams, so the Air Force, artillery, and infantry and tanks closely cooperated on the battlefield because each of them had specific advantages and disadvantages. In rapid order, they conquered Poland, the Low Countries, and France. While these developments were happening, the US looked for an appropriate response. However, the US Army perceived the tanks as the main threat instead of the combined arms approach. Because the US Army deemed the tanks the main threat, they started fearing massed tank assaults. However, it was not an accurate depiction of the real threat. For instance, the French had spread their tanks behind the front line where they could be engaged in small numbers, whereas the Germans used them in a combined arms approach. So, because the problem was inaccurately identified, an inappropriate response was also given. To complicate matters further, there were different opinions among the US military about the equipment of the tank destroyers. Some people were in favor of mechanized units, whereas others preferred towed units. Mechanized units had the benefit of mobility, whereas towed units were cheaper to produce and easier to conceal. You can see these developments in some of the tank destroyers that were created, such as the M3 gun motor carriage, the M10 gun motor carriage, the M18 Hellcat, as well as the M5 3-inch gun. So these tank destroyers were organized in battalions, and the mechanized units consisted of 3 line companies and a reconnaissance company and a headquarters company, and there were 12 guns in each company. The towed units had a similar organization, also 3 line companies, but they had 2 reconnaissance platoons and a headquarters company. The 614 Tank Destroyer Battalion was a towed unit. At that time, the American Army was segregated. So 10% of the population was a Black American, and units were created based upon race. Because the tank destroyers were a new branch of service, every 10th tank destroyer battalion created was a segregated unit. On 25 July 1942, the 614 Tank Destroyer Battalion was activated at Camp Carson, Colorado. In December 1942, the unit moved to Camp Bowie, Texas, and in March 1943, the unit moved to Camp Hood, Texas. At all of these camps, training proceeded as planned. However, the men did much more. Some of the soldiers had not finished high school. Others had not learned how to read. So they needed to be taught not only military conduct, but also spelling and other skills. This contributed to the Double V campaign that stood for victory over the enemy across the sea, as well as victory over the enemy at home. As I mentioned earlier, there was a lot of discussion about the equipment of the tank destroyer battalions, and likewise, the 614th changed from the M3 gun motor carriage to the M5 3-inch gun. In July 1943, the unit was selected as school troops. This was a blow to their morale, because instead of preparing for war, they helped others to prepare for war. they were needed to perform scenarios for the nearby officer candidate school or to demonstrate certain maneuvers for other soldiers. As one of the soldiers described it, it was as if he was a trained SEAL rather than a soldier. Things changed in October 1943 when Lieutenant Colonel Frank Pritchard assumed command of the battalion. He actively sought a combat engagement for his unit. In December 1943, training was intensified to prepare the unit for overseas deployment. And in June 1944, as they were getting ready to go across the sea, there was another blow to morale. It turned out that the 614th had not yet completed its indirect firing training, which is an essential function of the tank destroyers. After completing this, they departed on 10th of August 1944 across the sea. After the landings in Normandy, the Germans steadily retreated eastwards, hiding behind the Siegfried Line. In November 1945, the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion was assigned to the 95th Infantry Division. It would be their first time in combat, and as they were entering their positions, they were fired upon by enemy artillery. It was a scary situation, and some of the men hid in the half-tracks while others looked for shelter elsewhere. However, Lieutenant Walter Smith and Staff Sergeant Christopher Sturkey rallied the troops and saved both the men and the equipment. However, the attachment to the 95th Infantry Division did not last long. On 7 December 1944, the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion was attached to the 103rd Infantry Division. They would remain with them for the rest of the war. However, on 14 December 1944, a special moment arrived. A task force was assembled. Task Force Blackshear, named after its commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel John Blackshear. It consisted of a reinforced infantry company, a platoon of tanks, and 3rd Platoon of C Company 614 Tank Destroyer Battalions. Their goal was to take the town of Klimbach, which is a strategic town in the Alsace, France, which was used to reinforce nearby towns. By taking this village, the Americans hoped to starve out German troops holding nearby positions. After encountering a roadblock and being shelled by artillery, the column realigned and Lieutenant Charles Thomas took point. After topping a small rise, some say 1,000 yards outside of Klimbach, his vehicle was struck by a mine and he was fired upon by an anti-tank gun. He's in a perilous situation. He's on the reverse slope. He's being fired upon by an enemy machine gun. The first thing he does is deploy 2 of his tank destroyers, and they're also on the reverse slope. They're in exposed position and they rapidly start taking casualties. Meanwhile, the tanks refuse to go forward, stating that the road is mined and the tanks would get stuck in the mud. At the same time, Charles Thomas was still in the field and refused to leave until another officer could take over. The casualties were still mounting, and a single soldier ran between the 2 guns to aim and fire them. The other soldiers of the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion were engaging the enemy infantry that tried to overrun them. However, this situation couldn't last, and 2 more guns were brought forward. At the same time, American infantry flanked through the forest to take the town. Eventually, the casualties became so much that only 1 gun was left firing, the other 3 were destroyed. The single gun remaining was running low on ammunition. Robert Harris, a driver, heard about his friends running low on ammunition, and he proceeded to drive his half-track up the hill. As he was approaching the rise, he was warned by Lieutenant Colonel Blackshear not to proceed. When a lieutenant colonel tells you to not do something, you would expect a common soldier to behave. However, that was not Robert Harris. He ordered Lieutenant Colonel Blackshear out of the way and proceeded to drive to the other side of the hill, where he ran between the gun and his half-track, carrying boxes of ammunition. Klimbach was finally taken in a fight that lasted some 5 hours. All this time, the tank destroyers had been on the reversed slope in exposed positions. Charles Thomas was eventually evacuated, and he received the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions, being the second Black American to do so during the Second World War. 3rd Platoon of C Company 614 Tank Destroyer Battalion received the Distinguished Unit Citation, now also known as Presidential Unit Citation. As Lieutenant Colonel Blackshear said, the unflinching determination of this group constituted the most magnificent display of mass heroism I have ever witnessed. The fight was far from over in December 1944. However, the Battle of Klimbach did facilitate the relations between the white soldiers of the 103rd Infantry Division and the 614 Tank Destroyer Battalion. The black soldiers had earned the respect of the white soldiers, and they would remain with them for the rest of the Second World War. In December 1944, the Germans had also launched the Ardennes Offense, which resulted in the Battle of the Bulge. However, this operation did not proceed as planned, and instead, on 31st of December 1944, they launched another operation more to the south, Operation Nordwind. It would be the last major operation in the West. On 15 January 1945, General Anthony McAuliffe would take over as the commander of the 103rd Infantry Division. Previously, he had been the commander of the 101st Airborne Division that was engaged in the combat at Bastogne. He was immediately given a tough assignment because his unit would have to retreat in a blizzard, shortening the front lines, thus making it easier to resist German attacks. As several soldiers of the 103rd and 614th started settling in around Schillersdorf, France, they were suddenly surprised by German troops. Several of the soldiers of the 614 Tank Destroyer Battalion were captured, including some soldiers that had been involved in combat at Klimbach. The town of Schillersdorf was retaken, however, the captives had been led away. In February, the 103rd Infantry Division wanted information. They needed some prisoners in order to question them. However, soldiers of the 103rd Infantry Division had failed to capture them. Now it was up to the 614 Tank Destroyer Battalion to show people what they could do. They were going to raid an old mill guarded by 14 enemy soldiers. On the 5th of February 1945, 32 American soldiers went through the lines to proceed to the old mill. One group would surround the mill, while the other group would enter the mill. As they were approaching the target, a sergeant suddenly heard a click, and he wanted to fire at the Germans. However, his gun jammed. Instead, another soldier next to him opened fire, and swiftly hand grenades were thrown after them. As the dust settled, 8 Germans were killed, 6 more were captured, and none of the Americans were injured or killed. In spring 1945, the German front was collapsing. They were being attacked from the west, the south, and the east by the Allied armies. During this advance, the 7th Army moved across the south of Germany. And with this 7th Army went the 103rd Infantry Division and the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion. However, not all Germans were eager to surrender. On the 1st of May 1945, there was a fierce clash at Scharnitz, Austria. Several casualties were sustained by the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion, and several prisoners were taken. Among the casualties was the officer that commanded the raid in February. At a later moment, the 103rd Infantry Division was given the task of linking up with the 5th American Army in the south. The soldiers would advance through the Brenner Pass to link up with the Americans in Italy in order to form a unified front. During this historic moment, as the soldiers of the 103rd were advancing to the south, there were also soldiers of the 614th with them. And at the historic moment when the American armies linked up at the south of the Brenner Pass, the soldiers of the 614th were there with them. In May 1945, the war in Europe was over, and the 614th was used for occupational duties. In July 1945, the unit reported in Marseille, where it was supposed to become a service unit. However, this would be a waste of their talents. The soldiers had proven what they were capable of in combat, and also others recognized this. General McAuliffe, who was the commanding officer of the 103rd, intervened, as well as some other senior officers. As a result, the 614th returned to Austria for occupational duties. Now, the tank destroyer battalions were being deactivated one by one. It turned out that the massed German tank assault never materialized, and there were no other clear objectives. Besides, the German tanks had improved their armor. For instance, the latest versions of the Tiger tank were almost impenetrable to the 3-inch guns that the towed tank destroyer battalions used. On 31st of January 1946, the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion was deactivated. As I mentioned earlier, the unit had won the Distinguished Unit Citation, and Charles Thomas was the second Black American to receive the Distinguished Service Cross. However, an investigation after the Second World War revealed that not one Black American had earned the Medal of Honor. 7 Black Americans were selected to receive the Medal of Honor in 1997. Unfortunately, Charles Thomas was not there to see it. He had passed away in 1980. That brings me to the final part of the presentation, the legacy of the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion. So what did they do and what did they leave behind? In a way, they fought in combat like every other Tank Destroyer Battalion. They experienced losses, they experienced victories, but they were there and they did fight. The soldiers of the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion learned valuable skills that they could employ in civilian life. Furthermore, they had experienced a life that they could never have experienced at home. They had been in Europe and they had encounters they would have never had otherwise. The white soldiers of the 103rd Infantry Division also returned home with changed ideas about race and about segregation. And by doing this, the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion contributed both to victory over the enemy abroad, as well as victory over the enemy at home. So today we have talked about the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion, the Battle of Klimbach, the rest of their war service, and the end of the Tank Destroyer Battalions. I'm now ready to answer any questions that you might have.
Hi, Samuel. How are you?
I'm doing good, thank you. I'm honored to be here.
Where are you right now?
I'm in my home in Utrecht, the Netherlands.
I'm always amazed at how amazing your English is. The Dutch speak beautiful English, better than us English.
Ah, you have the fancy accent.
Well, that was a great presentation. Thank you very much. Tell us a bit about your background. Some of us watching might be quite surprised that a Dutchman would be devoting so much time and detail to a really great account of a black tank unit in Europe in World War II. Tell us how you got into World War II and how you came across this amazing unit.
I've always been interested in the history of the Second World War. The other book I wrote is about a family member of mine that was executed during the Second World War because he was in the Dutch resistance. What inspired me? I think that actually one of the things I noticed is that, for instance, some of the Black American units, they have very short or very small Wikipedia pages. Whereas, for instance, white American units had long pages and a lot of information was available online. And it actually made me quite curious as to why this was happening. I also wrote my master thesis about representation of Black American soldiers during the Second World War in contemporary media. So, for instance, Saving Private Ryan. I'm sure that everyone here has seen it. There's not a single Black American in the entire movie. On the other hand, there's a lot of attention to detail. I'm sure that all of you remember the scene where there's two German soldiers surrendering in the beginning. They're not talking in German, but they're talking in the Czech language. And the idea is that it represents like people that are forced to work for the Germans. So on one hand, there's a lot of attention to detail, but on the other hand, Black American soldiers are missing. After I wrote my thesis, the topic stuck with me. I was thinking like, okay, I have identified a problem. Now I want to be part of the solution. I think that this book is, well, it's part of the solution because it's a Black American unit that people can know more about if they want to. One of the things I'm actually quite proud of that we discovered during the research, I'm not sure if people are familiar with the history of Task Force Baum. It's one of the task force that was assembled at the end of the Second World War. And the idea was that they would go to a prison camp behind enemy lines to liberate some of the prisoners. One of the prisoners at the camp that was liberated for a short time because the task force failed in its mission was, if I recall, George Mitchell, and he was a Black American. It doesn't change the history, but it does show that they were there. Black American soldiers were there, and history is a lot more diverse than we sometimes realize.
Great. We could chat all day because I wrote a book called The Longest Winter. And believe it or not, oh my God, I'm showing my age. Over 20 years ago, I met Abraham Baum in San Diego.
Really?
Yeah. He was a great character. Maybe you could just quickly tell us a little bit more about Task Force Baum, because it's a wonderful story. We'll come back to your story in a while, but Task Force Baum is a great story. Tell us a little bit more about this gentleman, Mitchell, and Task Force Baum.
So I briefly mentioned Schillersdorf. He was one of the men that was captured there. He was also involved in the action during the Battle of Klimbach. And he was taken prisoner and brought to a prison camp. I'm not sure about the name. I can look it up later. But he was brought to a prison camp for officers. At this prison camp, there was also the son-in-law of General Patton.
Yeah.
So at the end of the war, I'm not entirely sure about the date, but the idea was that this prison camp would be moved, or the prisoners would be transported to another place in Germany. And Patton, whose son-in-law was captured, did not like this idea. So he sent out a small task force to proceed to this camp to liberate the prisoners. However, they did not have adequate information. I believe they assumed that some 400 prisoners will be there and they could bring them back. Instead, they found, I believe, some 2,000 prisoners. So this task force was there. They did not have the correct information, and they also did not have the equipment to carry back the officers. So what they did is they decided to proceed with some of the officers, and the others could follow the task force on foot. George Mitchell was one of the soldiers that followed on foot. However, this task force ran into some hardened German veterans, and they broke up the task force. And at the end of it, the day, or at the beginning of the morning, the task force surrendered. And in the end, the Germans had even more captives than before.
Great story. Abraham Baum told me that before he set off on what was, I hate to use this term, suicide mission, that's overused, but it kind of was a very crazy, high-risk mission. One of the most controversial of World War II. Had news come out about it at the time, Patton's career would have been over. It was outrageous to send a task force some 70 miles behind enemy lines in March of 1945 with the really only one objective, which was to save his son-in-law. This is something that today would be, you couldn't believe it. And Baum said to me that before the mission, Patton said, if you pull this off, I'll get you the Medal of Honor. And that didn't happen. But anyway, so I have a question here. Have you been able to contact veterans of their families, of the families of the 614th? Have you spoken to any of the relatives of guys that served in that great unit?
I've been in contact with some of them, and it was not easy to track them down. But it did provide a lot of interesting information. I'm thinking about Lawrence Johnson, if I pronounce it correctly. I've spoken with his children, and they provided, for instance, a picture of their father in uniform, as well as some of the stories that he shared about his experiences. It's a very common story. I'm sure that many American soldiers experienced it, but he remembers that he was fired upon the first time by enemy aircraft. So he was dismounted and he ran into a forest, but he did not hide behind the tree immediately because that's what his instructors told him that the enemy would fire upon. So he proceeded 10 meters further or 10 yards further, and that's where he hid. And he saw the fire coming from the ground behind it.
Same gentleman, Mr. Wesley Johnson, he said that he's been looking into 2 black units attached to the 7th Armored Division, and he's had a few problems trying to get real detail on those gentlemen. Can you tell us a little bit about the 7th Armored Division, the units attached to that division?
I'm not quite sure which units he's referring to. He's
talking about the 396th Quartermaster Truck Company.
I've not been in touch with any of their relatives.
Okay.
Although it looks like the lady Jasmijn Jans is in the Netherlands, so I can get in touch with her to see if I can help or be of assistance.
Okay, great. Can you tell us about your grandfather? I'm fascinated by the Dutch resistance. So tell us a little bit about him.
It's my granduncle that was killed during the Second World War. He was part of the Dutch resistance, as well as several other family members. But yeah, he was, how to say this? He could sometimes be a bit stubborn. What I mean is that at a certain moment, they received information that the Germans were going to visit his house to check it out. And they removed all the weapons that he had stored at his house, except for a single pistol. And this pistol was, of course, discovered and later present also at his execution.
Question here from Marvin Williams. How did the 614th officers receive their commission?
It's they went through officer candidate school.
Right.
And because the tank destroyers were a new branch of service, also 10% of the soldiers or 10% of the units to be established had to be segregated. Of course, this also meant that segregated officers, Black American officers, were often used for those kind of units. It was a bit complicated situation because Black American officers could not be put over white American soldiers due to segregation.
Can you tell us a bit about some of the racism that the unit encountered while they were in the US?
It's
Did you come across examples where they were, where they felt bitter about it, where it was egregious?
actually, there's one example that it's also present at the end of the book. It's Christopher Sturkey. So he comes back from the war. He's a hero. He received the Silver Star, and he's put on his uniform, including all of his medals. And he wants to go visit his wife, who's working at a factory. And as he goes there, she's still working, so he waits for her shift to end. And in the meantime, he goes into a restaurant to get some food. And once he entered, he is told, "We don't serve your kind of people here." And it's an example of how twisted it could be in the past with segregation. So he's a hero. He's risked his life for others. He brought liberty to Europe, but he returns home and he's told that he cannot get a hamburger somewhere.
How were they treated in the European theatre? How were this unit treated in the European theatre by senior American staff?
It depended on whom the senior officers were. Many officers of the 103rd Infantry Division, they have actually praised the 614 Tank Destroyer Battalion. Several of them prevented that the unit would be transformed into a service unit, and others offered similar praise for the performance of the unit. Charles Hafner, the previous commander of the 103rd Infantry Division, he said, "At first I didn't want your soldiers, and now I don't want to get rid of your soldiers," to Frank Pritchard.
Tell us a little bit about the Medal of Honor campaign post-war. The notion that not one Black American had received the Medal of Honor, and then in the 90s, I believe it was 1997, 7 were received the medal. Can you tell us a little bit about that campaign? Who started it? Where did it get political impetus? Why did it come about, basically?
It started way before, because at the end of the Second World War, many Black American newspapers started writing about the lack of, credit for Black American soldiers. One of the articles was titled "Not One in a Million." So out of the million Black American soldiers that fought during the Second World War, not a single one of them was awarded the Medal of Honor. Of course, there's also some factors that have to be taken into account. Many Black American soldiers served in service units where they were not used in combat. And because they were not used in combat, there were less opportunities to display their heroism. At the end of the Second World War, also other efforts were made. I'm thinking about David Williams of the 761st Tank Battalion, who took several steps in order to give credit to his men. Of course, they were a segregated tank battalion, and they won the Distinguished Unit Citation. One of the men involved, Reuben Rivers, was also later awarded the Medal of Honor. At first, he had been given the Distinguished Service Cross, and later he was given the Medal of Honor.
I have a really good question here from Wesley Johnson, and he mentions the case of the Weareth 11 during the Battle of the Bulge. That's a case where black soldiers were executed by the Germans. And he points out that this illustrates how the Germans treated some captured black troops. The 11 were trying to make their way back to American lines, but were captured by the Germans and then tortured first, actually, and then executed. And there's now a monument at Weareth, Belgium, commemorating them. I've actually been there twice to that very spot. Why do you think it took so long for most people to understand that black Americans have actually fought in the European theater, in the air and on the ground and at sea? Why do you think it took so long for these gentlemen to be recognized properly? Do you think they still have been sufficiently recognized?
I still think there's a lot of stories that have not been told as often or as much as they could have been. I still think that, especially, for instance, like games, video games lately are making an effort to include Black American soldiers in their stories in an accurate way. For instance, I believe the latest Call of Duty has a campaign where you play as a soldier of the 93rd Infantry Division in the Pacific.
Right.
And I believe there's also another video game where at a certain moment you play as an officer in the 761st Tank Battalion. So I think that in a way, these are good efforts, but I still think there's a lot more to do. As to why they did not receive credit, I think it's part of at that time, it was part of an ongoing discussion about can we let them be soldiers? And if you think about how difficult it has been for some of the Black American combat units to actually reach the front line, it can be quite hard to admit that, okay, they fought well and they contributed to the victory over the Germans or over the Japanese. Like I said, I think it's hard to admit your errors.
How about this then? We look at the fall of 1944. We're running out of men. This is the big issue for everybody on the Western Front. Patton's very worried about it. Eisenhower, you name it. They just don't have enough young bodies to throw into the front lines. Does this shortage of manpower explain to some extent the fact that black units were increasingly deployed in Europe?
I'm actually thinking about the black volunteer infantry units. There were some segregated platoons that were established at the end of the Second World War that were attached to white American units. Many of these units fought really well, and I think to a certain extent it can indeed explain why certain decisions were made. Also, as the war progressed, there was a lot more optimization, a lot more efficiency in the logistics, which explains why they needed less soldiers to handle certain things. Think, for instance, of the Red Ball Express.
Right. At Friends, we're very proud that we have an annual award, the McGehee Award, which is named after an incredible red tail pilot. So at the core of our mission is to remind Americans that all Americans in many ways gave towards that great victory over fascism and racism in the Pacific and Europe. Tell us a little bit about Charles Thomas then. It's a sad story. Here's a guy that's finally recognized, but he's dead when he gets the medal. I know that people know that the majority of Medal of Honor recipients receive the medal posthumously, but it seems particularly poignant and sad in his case, because if he'd wanted anybody to be alive in the White House with that medal around their neck, it would have been him. Tell us a little bit about Charles Thomas and his family and his story after the war.
So he was an officer in the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion, and he was the commander of C Company. He did not have to be present on 14 December 1944 when the task force was supposed to take Klimbach, but he did go there because he wanted to be with his men. What happened is that, of course, after the battle, he went home and he had sustained severe injuries. One of the arms, I believe his right arm, if I say it correctly, was especially weakened, and he could not use it as efficiently as he had before. Eventually, he went into IT, and he was one of the early computer programmers. And I believe in 1980 he died.
Right.
It's in his case, it's especially, or at least one of the things that stuck with me is that he always said, I was supposed to draw fire, but I did not expect so much.
Did you look at letters and diaries? How much detail did you go into in terms of your research? Because they're at the front in Europe, but the lives of their families back in the US are significantly different to the lives of other Americans, white Americans. Did you come across interesting correspondence, letters, diaries? Tell us a little bit about some of the intimate details that you came across of these extraordinary men.
I'm thinking about Sergeant Dillard Booker. He was a sergeant in 3rd Platoon of C Company. And after the war, he wrote several papers about his war experiences. And he was very proud of what he had done. And through his writing, you can sense the pride that he has, which I think is it's a very humbling feeling. He also writes very openly about some of the questions that he had about some of his men. So after the battle at Schillersdorf, where half of the platoon was captured, they received reinforcements. And at a certain moment, he's very concerned about how are these men going to perform when they get into combat. Luckily, they performed really well, and he did not have any doubts about them afterwards.
We have a statement again from Wesley Johnson. It's really interesting. He says, I was honored to be a pallbearer at the burial of a Black Bulge veteran about 10 years ago. I'd been inspired by him to research his family tree, and I discovered that one of his ancestors was one of the freed Black slaves who joined the Union Army in the US Civil War. So there's a long history here of Blacks serving the United States. Thank you so much for highlighting another example, a really important example during World War II. Where does your passion, apart from your family background, where does your passion for World War II come from? Because I think it's really inspiring for me to think that here's a young Dutchman writing in great detail with great enthusiasm about a rather obscure American unit in World War II. Are there other people like you? Are you a one-off, or are there other people like you that are just as interested in World War II of your generation in Europe, in Holland?
I think that there are many people that are interested, especially among my friends, or at least they say they're interested. Actually, I do think in a sense I'm a one-off, because I have not spoken to many 29-year-olds that have published a book or several books already. Of course, I'm bragging. Writing a book takes a lot of time and effort. And I'm lucky that I'm in a position where I can do so. Previously, I had a job where it was quite easy to, because of my schedule, I could easily work in the weekends or when I had off. It paid quite well, so I did not have other concerns that others might have about their financial situation.
So how do young Europeans like yourself, how do they look at World War II? Is it something really, really distant, or are they more connected in a way to the war because they're living where they were occupied or where the war occurred? Young Americans are living in a country where no one was killed. A couple of people were killed by a Japanese balloon in Oregon during the Second World War. if you go to your hometown, I mean, the war is everywhere in terms of damage, in terms of reconstruction, in terms of people's memories. Tell us a little bit about this difference between your generation and the generation here of Americans, and how you can't help but in some ways remember or think about World War II, at least at some point.
I'm actually thinking about all of the memorials that we have in the Netherlands. And these can be small or large memorials. These can be, for instance, say all the people that were killed during the Second World War in a certain village. But we also have very small memorials. I'm thinking of a certain plaque it's a couple of streets from here. It's not even very far. A British bomber was flying over the city and it was shot down by German aircraft and it dropped on a couple of houses. Several Dutch people, as well as I believe the pilot and the navigator, were killed. And it's a plaque on the wall, and
Right.
it tells this story. And it's just an example of how if you're walking through the street, you can see the story and you learn about, okay, this is what happened in this street. This is what happened during the Second World War in this house. We also have stolpersteinen. These are small stones that are put on the ground and they're a little bit above walking distance. So you stumble upon them, so to say. These are reminders of people that were deported and did not return. I know that in some cities, for instance, they do this with members of the Dutch resistance that died. And it's small reminders like this that remind you of the history and the things that have happened.
Well, we have a comment here from Julie Ornelas, and I think that she echoes certainly my view and hopefully many other people. Great presentation. Thank you so much. We have to unfortunately leave you in a minute or so. We have a wonderful hour coming ahead. But I just wanted to say thank you so much for taking so much energy and time out of your own life to honor these liberators. And there are so many times that I've been told by Americans who visited Europe and in particular Holland that, you know, they find it strange that certainly in Normandy and absolutely in Holland at Margarten, for example, that you guys honor and respect and celebrate and commemorate American sacrifice in World War II in some ways more than Americans do back in the US. It's something that is very powerful and moving and inspiring. You know, the Dutch in particular do a fantastic job of remembering, particularly the 82nd and 101st Airborne troops that were lost during Operation Market Garden. So I want to say thank you so much as a Dutchman. Thank you to you and to your fellow Dutch citizens for all you do to remember the sacrifice of Americans in World War II, where we've had a wonderful presentation. Thanks a lot for joining us. Best of luck.
Thank you.
Okay, so next we have coming up at the beginning of the hour at 11 o'clock, we have Norm Berkey, who's going to tell us all about his father, and we're going to learn an awful lot about an astounding American division, the 10th Mountain Division. So please join us again at 11 o'clock. Thank you very much. The gentleman we're going to hear from next, I'm very excited about this story. I have met Bob Dole, and I have actually been to the place where Bob Dole was wounded in northern Italy. Took a wonderful photograph with a group of other travelers. So we are now going to listen to the story of Norman Berkey. And I actually wrote this introduction, so I'm going to read it straight away. I want to make sure that you all understand exactly who he is and why his story is going to be really entertaining and interesting to listen to. So Mr. Berkey was 5 years old when his father, Norman L. Berkey, was killed on March the 12th, 1945, while serving with the legendary Climb to Conquer 10th Mountain Division in Italy. Mr. Berkey is going to tell us what he actually unearthed about his father and his service, and just going to describe his life as a war orphan, what it was like to not have a father, basically, to grow up in post-war America with that gaping absence. His mother, Anna Berkey, never remarried and raised all three of her children on her own. And in doing so, she was every bit as heroic, Mr. Berkey is going to explain to us, as his long-lost father. So without any further ado, here we have Mr. Berkey.
Hello, everyone. My name is Norm Berkey, and I am the proud son of Private Norman Berkey, who was killed in World War II. And I'm here today to speak about my dad and our experiences that came out of him losing his life in World War II. I've divided my presentation into three segments. These are strictly relate to what we knew about our dad, and they have no relevance beyond that. The three divisions are the Sound of Silence, the Desert Years, and the Years of Plenty. Despite our circumstances, mainly our limited financial resources, all in all, we had a happy childhood and good and prosperous adult lives. Except for our dad losing his life, our lives were not much different than those that lived around us before, during, and after the war. However, without the support of our extended family, life would have been much more difficult for us. My brother and I also had many positive male role models in our life, but we were missing a dad. Our mom did not remarry and, in fact, never dated anyone. I'll refer to my mom and tell you more about her later in this presentation. I also need to add that this is our experience and is not typical of the experience of other war orphans. I'll also come back to that part later in this presentation. Our family background is poor dirt farmers from the Reading area in the Pennsylvania Dutch country in southeastern Pennsylvania. It's a bit ironic that my dad, who never saw a pair of skis in his life, would end up being assigned to the 10th Mountain Division. Due to alcoholism, there was a great deal of pain in the families of both my paternal grandparents. But my dad seems to have been unscathed by it. My great-grandmother, after giving birth to 4 children, died at an early age when my grandfather was 6 years old. Due to his father's alcoholism, there was a family intervention. The 4 children were split up among relatives. My grandfather and his brother were sent to live with his mom's sister and her husband, who were childless. His older brother was deaf. He and a deaf friend decided to leave home. Unfortunately, they were both killed by a train because they could not hear it coming. My paternal grandmother's father was also a serious alcoholic, and you could immediately spot poor people by their dress back in those days. At this late date in my life, this presentation has given me a much greater appreciation for how much I owe to these people. My mom's family was poor, but her family background was more stable than my dad's. However, we recently learned that my maternal grandfather actually owned a farm, but after the barn burned, he could not afford to rebuild it. So thereafter, he was a sharecropper and had to move his family several times. Our parents, my mom and my dad, were children of the Depression, but somehow our dad managed to graduate from high school, and my mom finished 10th grade. My dad was able to take advantage of the wartime economy, and at the time he was drafted, was working in a defense plant in Reading, Pennsylvania. They started married life living with my dad's family in a small farmhouse without heat or running water. She also had to live with a mother-in-law due to her difficult life, who could be a real burden on her daughters-in-law. I arrived in 1940 and my brother in 1941. But by 1943, they were able to afford to buy a house in a nearby village. That was just in time for my sister to arrive in July of 1943. We've heard 2 versions but we still don't understand how a man with 3 kids who worked in the defense industry managed to get drafted, but my dad was drafted sometime in April of 1944. He did his basic training at Fort Blanding near Jacksonville, Florida, and then was sent to join the 10th Mountain Division at Camp Swift, just outside of Austin, Texas. The 10th Mountain Division, due to political connections, was formed by the skiing community as an elite volunteer outfit in 1941. However, at that time, the Army had other pressing issues at hand, and as a result, the 10th was sent to Colorado to train, and when they arrived, there wasn't even a base to house them. So except for a disaster event in the Aleutians in 1942, where 11 soldiers of the 10th were killed by friendly fire, the 10th continued to train in Colorado and eventually at Camp Swift in Texas. Some vets told me that the training in Colorado, well, in many ways, was more difficult than the actual combat they faced. At least my dad missed the mountain training in Colorado, and so he was assigned to Company 85C as a BAR man. That's the Browning automatic rifle, if you're not familiar with that term. It's kind of halfway between the rifle and the true machine guns. The 10th Mountain Division left Norfolk, Virginia in January of 45. My dad shipped out on the ship West Point. The 10th Division was assigned to fight the Germans in the hill country north of Florence, Italy. As an interesting note, I didn't know this until I made a trip to Italy, which I'll talk about in a minute, but there was actually a Brazilian battalion on the left of the 10th Mountain Division, and the guys said they weren't much of a fighting outfit, but they were there making their presence known during World War II. We have several pictures of him with an Italian family shortly after they arrived in the hill country. Apparently they were bivouacked in and among Italian families when they first arrived in the hill country. In March 1945, Company 85C helped capture Mount Dell'Espe near the small town of Casteldiano, but while they were under counterattack, he was killed on March 11th. While his buddy had gone back to get some food, an 88 artillery shell hit the tree behind the foxhole, and my dad was killed instantly. We have the exact details of his death, thanks to a book written by 2 of his comrades after the war. The book is Good Times and Bad Times by John Embry and Hugh Evans. It is a history of Company 85C. Another interesting note is that Bob Dole was injured about a mile from where my dad was killed. However, he was a replacement, and he got injured almost as soon as he arrived on the front, so the 10th Mountain guys never got to know him personally. And so just an interesting sidelight. Although I was 5 when he was killed, I have blanked out memories of that time. I was told that our mom fainted when the news arrived, and I was told much later in life that I was running up and down the street crying for my daddy. With a few exceptions, my childhood memories don't really start until I entered the 1st grade. Also, my grandfather never attended church again after his son was killed. I think he had just experienced too much pain in his life. Another side note, his dad actually committed suicide in the 1920s, and it fell to my grandfather to make all the funeral and burial arrangements. So, there was my mom, a widow with 3 children at age 26. Now she is both mom and dad, in charge of all the finances and living in a very old house that needed continual repair. She was also in charge of keeping the coal furnace going all winter, and that was a pride thing for her, that the fire never went out. Of course, this also began as soon as our dad left for the Army. We did not have an automobile, so we became totally dependent on others for rides when necessary. My Uncle Paul faithfully picked us up every Sunday to go to Sunday school and church, and my Grandpa Berkey took me and my brother to get a haircut every 2 weeks. We did have a butcher, a baker, a milkman, and a dry cleaner who came through our little town on a regular basis. There was also a bus that came through town and took us each day into the huge city. We thought it was huge at the time of Reading, Pennsylvania. It's a town of about 100,000 people. We also spent each Sunday afternoon on my Grandpa Miller's farm with our cousins. My mom had 11 sisters and a brother, so it was quite a crowd when everybody came. After we got a bit older, my brother and I spent every other weekend on the Berkey farm with my grandparents, our Uncle John, and sometimes our cousins, Butch and Bobby, where we were expected to help with the farm work. We were also very close to our cousin Jim and spent a lot of time with his family. We were taken once by relatives to Ocean City, New Jersey, but otherwise the highlights of our year were the annual visits to Hershey Park, Pennsylvania by our church and the Reading Fair. I must say that except for a few bleak Christmases, I never really felt that I was particularly deprived. There was also shopping trips to Reading on that bus I just mentioned. Our idea of eating out was a hoagie at the bus stop while we waited for the bus trip home. That was our life. We got more mobile once I was able to drive, but our lives revolved around the local area. Talking about our dad was not taboo, but I cannot recall any instances where people talked about about our dad to us. In fact, I found later in life that one of my best friend's dad was a good buddy of my dad's, but by the time he told me that, his dad was dead. I also had an Uncle Red who was a good friends with my dad, but he wouldn't talk about the World War II at all, although he was a vet, let alone talk to us about our dad. That was even so when our dad was brought back for burial in 1947. But I have to say that even though nothing was ever said about our dad, I think the local community supported us by giving us rides. I can only remember one time when we had to walk home one winter Friday evening. My mom was really a brave person. She allowed me and my brother, we were in junior high school, and we would ride that bus up to the next town, and they had movies on Friday night. So we would get on the bus, go up there, watch the movie, and we had no idea how we were going to get home, but we always managed to find somebody who would give us a ride. There's another sad note to our family history. My Uncle John, our dad's younger brother, met and married a German girl. She and her mother were starving after the war, and my aunt was sent to the U.S. to live with relatives. But she had severe emotional issues all her life and was actually institutionalized several times. She also had to deal with that very unsupportive mother-in-law. So those were the silent years. Now we come to the desert years. The desert years began when college time rolled around. World War II orphans were eligible to go to college under the GI Bill. I graduated from Penn State, and my sister graduated from Kutztown University in Pennsylvania. My brother tried college, but at that time it really wasn't for him. So he eventually was able to make a good career as a pattern maker, working in wood. But even more importantly, he continued to live with my mom in the house our parents bought back in 1943. He devoted himself to our mom, the local volunteer fire company, and later in life was taking courses at the local community colleges. Although she wasn't particularly close to home, my sister also spent a great deal of time helping to take care of her mom. Neither of them ever married, so it came that when we had our kids became their kids. My wife and I graduated from college one Saturday, got married the next. We packed all of our belongings in the back of a 1955 Pontiac and had a week to find a place to live in New York City, where I was going to start my career. By 1965, we had our two girls, and we're off making a life for ourselves, as were my brother and sister. Fortunately, we always lived close enough to home for regular family visits due to my being transferred to different cities, but always in the Middle East part of the United States. During those years, our girls grew up, went to college, and got married. My older daughter gave birth to her 4 children, and our younger daughter also gave birth to her son in those years. One comment about my mom: she was a great mom and had a great deal of wisdom. Until her mother-in-law died, she allowed her mother-in-law to tend our dad's grave at the local cemetery. Memorial Day was the only time we had any thoughts about our dad, and those weren't very deep thoughts. We lost our mom in 1995, and now she is buried next to our dad. There were significant years, but frankly, the word dad was not even in our vocabulary of me or my brother or my sister or our mom, really, or any of our relatives, as I mentioned before. So now we come to the years of plenty. The silent years and the desert years came to a sudden halt with a single magazine article. At the time, I was a subscriber to Newsweek. My wife was out of the house, and an article in the back of the current issue caught my attention. As it turned out, it was written by a fellow World War II orphan who actually worked for Newsweek, and it hit me like a bomb. I immediately went into mourning mode, and a whole new life opened for me and my siblings and my family. The article mentioned a group called AWAN. I'll get to them shortly. But also recommended that war orphans contact their dad's association. I should add that perhaps you are aware of this, but most units from all the services established associations after the war, and the 10th Mountain Division was no exception. I immediately looked up the websites for both organizations, that's the 10th and AWAN, and I asked the 10th to put a buddy search item in their next issue of the Blizzard, their newsletter. Almost immediately before their next Blizzard issue was published, I was inundated with cards and letters and phone calls. My oldest daughter, who's a librarian, also found a book by 2 war orphans called Lost in the Victory. It related the experience of many war orphans and was really a boon to my budding education about our dad's time in the service and the results of him being killed. I have to admit that I didn't take full advantage of the information offers that I got at that time. I was so overwhelmed, I really didn't know what to ask, and by the time I was ready, several of his closest friends were gone. I had built up this fictional account about bad service, and that was not even close to what actually happened to him. For one thing, since he was from Pennsylvania, I just assumed he was with the 28th Division, which is a Pennsylvania division. I'll finish up the 10th Mountain part of the story before moving on to my experience with AWAN. As a prelude, I want to add that several vets who survived World War II were instrumental in starting the ski industry in Colorado. That was after World War II, of course. In fact, the 10th Mountain memorabilia are housed in the Denver Library and the Colorado Historical Society. My wife and I became members of the D.C. chapter of the Descendants Association and immediately made new friends and were able to attend some regional conventions. For tax reasons, there's a 10th Association and a 10th Descendants Organization, but for practical reasons, most of the meetings and conventions included both groups. During the Afghan War, one of my pleasures was driving several of my dad's comrades to Walter Reed Hospital in D.C. to visit some of the current 10th Mountain wounded soldiers who were wounded during the Afghan War. Their camaraderie was immediate, and I know my dad experienced that while he was serving. I'll talk about some common traits of World War II orphans in just a minute, but I also had an experience there. Many of us have this thing that we observe life, but we really don't participate in it. And I am one of those types of people. And I continually find myself kind of on the edges of not really joining in what's going on. It's gotten better over the years, but I still experience it. We've also been able to, getting back to the 10th, also been able to attend several national conventions and actually served on a committee that organized a national convention in the DC area way back in 2013. The highlight trip of the convention was a trip to see the World War II memorial. And what we did is we loaded all the vets and everybody else on buses and took them down to the World War II memorial. And once the other visitors realized who these guys were, they were immediately surrounded and inundated with well wishes and thanks. An interesting side note, that convention took place actually while the federal government was shut down during one of those battles. But just to make sure there were no problems, we actually had a couple congressmen on the bus with us. But the park rangers just opened the barricades to us, and we had no problem whatsoever. The 10th also began trips back to Italy in the 1960s. They would go every 3 years, and of great importance to us. It was a trip that me and my wife took back to Italy in 2003. The trips all start on Memorial Day in the Florence Cemetery, and then proceed to celebrations in several hill towns north of Florence, where the 10th did their fighting. A group of Italian World War II reenactors accompany each trip, and although they were aging, they also had a group of Alpinis. They were the guerrilla fighters, the Italian guerrilla fighters, who are helping fight the Germans. In fact, they were fighting even before the 10th got there. John Embry and Hugh Evans, the guys I mentioned before, and several other people connected with 85C were on that trip. John Embry was able to point out the route that they took up to Mont Delespée to take the mountain from the Germans. And Hugh Evans, on a side trip on Wednesday of that trip, was able to locate the foxhole where my dad was killed. I actually have a picture of me in the foxhole where my dad was killed. Another interesting thing that happened on that trip is we were in this small town being entertained by the locals, and we met this lady from Long Island. And she was visiting her Italian family at that time and came out for the celebration. And as it turned out, her brother was one of those World War II nuts. We gave him a copy of a picture of the Italian family I mentioned earlier in the presentation, but we never heard from him, so we assumed that he was not able to locate the family. In fact, he wanted me to get in his car and go right then to start driving around trying to locate the family. I need to start to talk about this group that I owe so much. That's AWON, or the American World War II Orphans Network. We are all orphans and family members of men who were killed during World War II. I don't have a lot of time to tell you about its founding, but it's interesting that we all came to our interest in AWON in our late 40s and 50s. When I was younger, I just wouldn't have been interested, mainly due to time constraints. I was busy with my family and my career. There were no records kept, but an estimate based on the number of orphans receiving benefits from the Veterans Department, it's like more than a guesstimate. It's that World War II produced about 183,000 orphans. We at AWON have located maybe 3,000, but even at our height when the World War II memorial was completed, we never reached 1,000 in membership. It is amazing to a lot of us, but some orphans are simply not interested in their dads. I had a personal experience with that myself. So AWON can briefly be described as a gold star group on steroids. Simply put, it's all about our dads. One of our early members coined the phrase the wall of silence, and that is what many of us experienced, including me, and no one talked to us about our dads. And that was certainly my experience, as I related early in my talk. That was not universal, but it was pretty common. So when we meet a new member after hello, the next few words are almost always, "Tell me about your dad." I just had that experience at church just a few months ago. I learned that a lady I go to Sunday school with had a dad who was killed in World War II, and after we introduced ourselves, she immediately started telling me all about her dad. And of course, that's what I was interested in hearing about. Now, relationships with moms are a bit more complicated, a more complicated issue, and there really isn't time to address them here. As we know, many of the World War II vets came back with what we now call PTSD. We had an experience of that in our family, and this produced many unhappy marriages and lots of family dysfunction. So just like the World War II vets, we are slowly fading away. Very few of our children are interested in maintaining A1. But in our heyday, we had regional gatherings. We had one in York, Pennsylvania every April. Many of those continue to this day. And we also had national gatherings every 2 years. They continue. There was just one in New Orleans last year. We had them across the country. We would rotate to east, to central, to west, and back again. But we needed a local core group to organize the conventions, but it was also always under the supervision of our board of directors. We also continue to publish our newsletter called The Star. Some of my A1 sisters actually ended up running their dad's associations when the vets were no longer able to do it. But as you probably know, there are very few World War II vets still with us. So the highlights of our national gatherings were what we call the sharing circles. We broke into small groups, and everyone got a turn to talk about their dads. These were always very emotional events, lots of Kleenex boxes on the table, and our spouses had a separate event where they could talk about what it was like to live with a war orphan. We also brought in guest speakers to our conventions. We always had a rep from a group in Hawaii that recovers the remains from all wars. In fact, I think maybe they've been moved to the United States now. And additionally, one of our war orphans is married to a world-famous psychiatrist. His name is Vamek Volkan. He was at the University of Virginia. He's retired now. And his specialty was mourning. And he always made a presentation at our national conferences. And one thing I learned from him is that if we mourn as a child, we need to re-mourn as an adult. And that's certainly been my experience. Yeah, in my life, the experience I had. There is a U.S. cemetery in Margraten, Holland. Maybe you've heard about it. All the graves in Margraten have been adopted by Dutch families, and they keep passing it down to the newer generations. Many of our orphans have traveled to Holland and to Normandy for Memorial Day. A special bond has developed between the Dutch families and several of our A1 members. In fact, at our 2018 conference in Washington, D.C., a Dutch men's choir paid their own way just to come and sing for us. Very emotional, a time for both groups. Our members have also made trips to the Pacific to visit the places where their dads fought and died. On their last visit, they discovered the mile markers for the Death March, the Bataan Death March, were in bad shape, so they raised enough money among themselves and they had them replaced. It was my privilege, most of the time, I have to say, to serve on the board of directors of A1 for a bunch of years. One thing I learned from my corporate training days was group dynamics. And we had some catchwords for groups. Groups form, then they storm, then they reform, and actually, hopefully, perform. There were days when I thought we would never get past the storming part in A1, but our shared sense of purpose always allowed us to survive and, for the most part, to prosper. I will always be indebted to A1 for giving my dad back to my family. There is this group, I think you may have heard of them, called the Friends of the World War II Memorial, that arranges for continuous events and activities at the memorial. The executive director, Holly Rotundi, and the A1 board of directors have developed a special relationship over the years. In May 2016, Mother's Day and VE Day fell on the same day, and Holly put out the word that she would like somebody to come and talk to the group gathered at the World War II Memorial to talk about their mom. I didn't put the word out to anybody. In A1, I immediately accepted on my own behalf. And it was a great privilege. What a great mom we had. And my brother and sister, thanks to the generosity of the friends, they were able to attend also. And I was able to thank them publicly in front of everybody to tell them how much I appreciated how they cared for our mom until her passing. A final note about the memorial. Our founder, Annie Mix, a force to be reckoned with, somehow was able to join the organizing group. And some of the members of the committee, including her, wanted the names of the war dead to be named individually on a continuous loop. That wasn't really feasible, so the compromise was the stars that are at the memorial, each one of the stars representing 10,000 of those who died as a result of the World War II conflict. Just a final thought, another interesting note, something I learned at my time and with A1. There's actually a group in England called GI Trace, and they were formed to find the fathers of the children born to the fathers and British girls while the GIs were stationed in England, mainly prior to the invasion in France in 1944. An interesting group, and we have been able to find some of their stories over the years. Very meaningful, very moving, but some of them, frankly, very sad too. So, finally, I say thank you, Holly, once again for giving me this awesome opportunity to talk about my dad and my mom. So that's what I have to say, and I can now turn it over to any questions that you might have for me. Thank you.
Hello.
Yes, I was trying to unmute.
Oh, I'm the worst offender when it comes to that. How are you this morning?
I'm doing great.
Good. That was a great presentation. Thank you for being so emotional and honest. It's not often you hear people emote like that, talk about their deepest feelings. So I share something in common with you, which is that I am interested in this idea of what it's like to grow up as an orphan of a World War II hero. My mother's father died when she was less than a year old. He served in the British Navy, and as the grandson, not the son, but the grandson, I've seen an enormous impact of that death on my mother's life. I mean, it was extraordinary. So I just wanted to say thank you on behalf of friends. I know that you know Holly very well, but thank you for joining us. I really enjoyed the presentation. An amazing statistic I want you to react to, if it's okay. So around about 400,000 Americans lost their lives in World War II. And we have this number, 183,000, as you mentioned, were fathers. So that's almost 1 out of 2 guys that laid their lives down in World War II had a kid or kids. It's extraordinary when you think about it, isn't it? I never even came across that fact until I started researching your story and listened to you. Can you react to that? The idea that, you know, almost half of the men that gave their lives in World War II had children?
Well, I think there were several things going on. They were, frankly, at the beginning of their childbearing age with them and their spouses. I think there were a lot of rust marriages before the guys before the guys left, to fight either in Europe or the Pacific. And as a result of those marriages, I think a lot of children were conceived at that time. My dear friend, who has since died, her mom was actually in the operating room delivering her when she got the news that her husband was in fact missing. And he later turned out that he was killed. So I think that's part of the explanation for how many there were, how many children there were.
I have a great question here. Have you and Anne Mix figured out if your dads knew each other?
I'm sorry?
Have you and Anne Mix worked out if your fathers knew each other?
No, they did not. Her dad was an officer, and I think he was in some kind of command position. And my dad was, frankly, just another grunt.
Well, he wasn't another grunt. I've actually been to near where he was killed, and none of those guys that were there at that stage in the war were grunts.
No, they weren't.
Marvin Williams says, thank you for sharing your story. Has your dad's story been written for the Story Behind the Stars project started by Don Milne that writes memorials for fallen World War II heroes? Have you heard of that project? Have you heard of the Story
project?
Behind the Stars?
Say the project again.
Story Behind the Stars.
No. It's been told several places, and I've done several live histories, with a couple of groups, but not that particular group.
Right. Do you have any memories of your father at all? Do you have any memories at all?
I'm sorry?
Do you have any memories at all of your father?
Just a few vague memories. Just a couple. That's it. I don't know why I remember this, but he was hauling ashes from the coal furnace, and we were in my grandfather's 1929 pickup, and I was getting ashes dust in my eyes. I guess that's the most vivid for some reason, but no, just like I say, I blanked out a lot of stuff. So,
did you have father figures when you were growing up?
Yes.
Was there one father figure in particular that was very important to you?
Not one, but well, I guess there was one. My grandpa Berkey was probably the primary. We spent a lot of time on the farm with him, but my uncle John, my dad's younger brother, and I had many uncles. My mom, as I mentioned, had 11 sisters and a brother. So,
wow. Where are you speaking to us from? Where are you right now?
I'm in a retirement facility in Lancaster, Pennsylvania.
Right.
As I said, we moved around the Middle Eastern part of the U.S. several times, but we moved here to be closer to my brother. He actually still lives in the house that my parents bought in 1943, so he needs help. And then our younger daughter is about 45 minutes away, so that's how we chose our retirement facility.
What's your most vivid memory of your mother? When you think about your mother now, as I'm speaking to you, which memories flood back? What are the most vivid memories of your mother that you have?
She would spend time sitting at the kitchen table, smoking a cigarette, and she was just kind of looking, lost in her thoughts, just kind of staring into space. I don't think she ever, you never do, but I don't think she ever, recovered from the loss of her husband.
How long had they been married?
It's kind of an overused term, but I think they were really soulmates. I'm sorry.
How long had they been married?
They got married in 1940.
Right.
So
that was 5 years of that
yes.
marriage.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Have you thought at all why she didn't remarry? I mean, how old was she when your father died? She would have been
She was 26.
right. And
We received a letter from a friend from the 10th. One of my dad's comrades wrote to her after the war, and she wrote back to him. And after the man died, his widow got that letter back to us. In fact, I recited part of it at the ceremony at the World War II Memorial. She just said that she was going to raise the children the way that her husband would have wanted them raised. So that was her total devotion.
what do you remember about your first encounter with a World War II veteran? When did you first meet a World War II veteran?
Well, I hardly knew it, but my Uncle Red, he was in our life all the time. But as I said in my presentation, he never talked about the war, let alone my dad. So I guess that he was the most prominent. But then my other uncle, we didn't realize what it was because people didn't know. But he was a mess when he came back from the war, just alcoholic and all the usual things that come out of that. So we saw him on a regular basis.
Well, I think what's moving and interesting about your story is that you go right to the heart of the impact and the damage that was done by that war on families. And, we tend to look at World War II through rather romanticized lens sometimes, and we forget the enormous tragedy and suffering that accompanied that very important victory. What was the single event in your life that helped you to heal from the loss of your father? What was the most important thing that helped you to start to heal? I assume you're still healing, but what began that process for you?
That article in Newsweek really started it all. Like I said before that, we didn't talk about our dad. We didn't celebrate Memorial Day, except for putting flowers on the grave, which my mom did and my grandmother did. I never did that. So it all really started. I have to give a shout out. I see my good buddy, Kathy Lecomte, has tuned in today. Thank you, Kathy, for being here.
We have a question from Julie, and she said, she asked, did your mum receive any letters from your dad while he was serving?
Yes, it's a bit of an embarrassment. I only keep them because they're in my dad's handwriting, but I much appreciated the previous presentation. We have a bunch of postcards that he wrote, and frankly, they're just totally racist. I mean, let's face it, we were a racist country back in those days, but I keep them because they are in his dad's handwriting, or my dad's handwriting.
So often we come across, when I do talks and when we meet children of the so-called greatest generation, so often this issue comes up. Why didn't my dad talk about the war? Why didn't they tell me about everything they did in Normandy or wherever it was? Why didn't they tell me what it was like to liberate Paris or Rome, what it felt like to fight in that war? Can you answer that question? Why so many of those men never talked about it and didn't talk about it with their families in particular? And this is a really important issue here. Why didn't they talk about it?
I've heard a couple of them say that it was so bad, I just don't want to expose my family to how bad it really was. And I think, like us, I think they were as a way of protecting their family, if you will, from hearing about the horrors that they saw. That's my surmise.
Tell us about your first trip to Italy. That must have been a very moving, incredible experience Tell us about going to Italy for the first time. I
Oh
assume
my
that
gosh.
I assume that you actually went to where your father was killed.
Yes.
Tell
Yeah.
us,
We
tell us
start,
more.
the main trip starts on Memorial Day in Florence Cemetery. And if you have ever been to a military, you've been, you know, a hush just comes over people when they see how beautiful they are, how well kept they are, and you think about, the lives. On our trip, there was a young man in the U.S. military, actually stationed in Rome, and I don't know how he got to Florence, but he was there, and he was just walking up and down the roads, looking at the graves, and just had tears in his eyes. So that's the beginning, and then you get up into the hill country, and you see the conditions that they actually fought under, and just the tents, which I know best, just did some amazing things. While they were fighting up there. And then, to top it all off, my dad's buddies take me to that place, which is probably gone now, but was still there when we went, obviously, and just to have him say, one of his buddies say, there it is, that's where he was when he was killed. The northern Italy, where they fought, is more like a resort area now, and the buildings were creeping up the mountain further and further. So I doubt if the site exists anymore, because it's a beautiful place.
It's a really lovely part of Italy. I was there 4 or 5 years ago. Actually visited that 10th Mountain Museum that the two Gandolfini brothers tend very well. Have you met those guys? Have you met those gentlemen?
No. I'm trying to remember the reenactor. Oh, I can't think of his name. He went on all the trips. I spent some time with him.
It's beautiful country. It's like the best place for wine and food in Italy. Some people would say in Europe. And to think that your father was fighting there on a grim, horrible March day and lost his life to free people in that region is extraordinary. I have a wonderful question here from Kathy. And she says, many World War II veterans told me they didn't talk about the war because they wanted to get on with their lives. They had just spent some of their prime years fighting a war. They wanted to get back to normal, have a career, start a family. They didn't want to dwell on the past. They also told me that they felt the real heroes of World War II were those who didn't come home. They did not see themselves as heroes. Do you see your father as a hero? How do you feel about your father?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Tell us about that. I mean, that's what is a hero? What is a hero to you? Why do you feel so proud of him?
Well, he was part of the great generation. It was a war. It was probably the most just war maybe in history of, trying to get rid of Hitler and Mussolini and the Japanese too at the time. And they went and they did it. And to actually see what they went through or have an idea what they went through is, just I can't imagine myself doing that.
Do you stay in touch with any 10th Mountain veterans? Are there any 10th Mountain veterans that you still see or communicate with?
They're all gone. We've recently moved. We were part of the group around DC, and I don't think there are any left. I got to know a bunch of them. There were a bunch still left. Hugh Evans, I mentioned, I think he's still alive, but John Embry's been gone for a bunch of years. So, no, I don't stay in touch with any of them. What I do though is any vet I meet, I include policemen too. I just shake their hand and say thanks for your service. So I have that. That's a part of me, I guess, that is a kind of a thank you to my dad for his service.
We have a question here from Julie, and she says, how can teachers keep these stories alive? How would you like your father to be remembered?
I have I have a fellow war orphan from around the Reading, Pennsylvania area, and he gets, I don't know how he does it, but he gets to speak in schools. And any history teacher, I would say, bring us in, World War II, Vietnam War, Afghan, bring them in and expose your students to, what it takes to defend this country.
If we were to bring you into classrooms in the DC area, what would your main message be? What would be the takeaway that you would want young Americans to have today about what your father gave, which was everything? What message would you like them to have most of all?
Rather trite saying, but freedom is not free. It takes work to keep it. And, going back to the John Kennedy days, ask what you can do for your country rather than what can your country do for you. I think that would be the centrality of a message. And as well as talking about the sacrifices that were made for them to be here and enjoy the privileges that they do.
Well, I have to say thank you so much. I think we've all been touched and moved and inspired by your story. Thank you for sharing it with us.
It's been my pleasure.
Believe me, at Friends.
And thank you, Holly, again. Yeah.
Yeah, she's here, and believe me.
Thank you, Norm.
We're doing everything we can to make sure your father and many other of those 183,000 are remembered, and we're actually going into as many schools as we can to make sure that young people today know what that sacrifice is about, right, and make sure that they will remember your father and his generation. So I wanted to say thank you very much. We've had a comment saying thank you for your sincerity and your powerful presentation. I wish you a very good weekend, and I just wanted to say on behalf of Friends and Holly and everybody else here, thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
You're quite welcome. My pleasure. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. I hope everyone stays with us for the next 3 or 4 minutes until we begin again at the top of the hour, and we're going to have a really special guest. I'm very, very excited about this. We're going to have one of the last surviving World War II nurses who actually worked in perhaps the most affecting and moving environment with severely damaged young Americans during World War II. So Helen Siragusa will be with us at 11 o'clock. Please stay with us for yet another, I hope, wonderful hour with Friends of the World War II Memorial. Thank you. Hope everyone's enjoying this. Actually, what is quite a very nice morning in DC here. I'm not actually at the memorial, but I'm going to walk down there later on today, this afternoon. We have a wonderful, wonderful lady joining us. We're going to watch an interview, a pre-recorded interview with her first, but then we're going to have plenty of time to chat with Helen Barry Siragusa, and I'm going to read her bio now so that everybody knows exactly who we're going to be spending the rest of this morning with. She was born in 1923 and is one of, as I said, the last surviving World War II nurses. She served in the Navy, tending to the Navy's most seriously injured men at the St. Albans Naval Hospital on Long Island. She worked in the paraplegic and quadriplegic ward, B11. And I ask you to pause and think about that, quadriplegic ward, where she witnessed extraordinary courage and resilience. I should add that her own deep faith sustained her through the loss of her fiancé, a Marine. Happily, however, she later married a Navy flight surgeon, stayed in the Navy, very wise woman, and raised 8 children. And today she lives in Maine. So we're going to watch a video that friends recorded, and then we're going to actually speak with Helen herself. So without any further ado, here's Helen from some time ago, and then we'll be talking to this wonderful lady live herself. Thank you.
I was born in the hospital in Newark, New Jersey. My parents lived in a place called Vailsburg, which was on the outskirts of Newark. And I lived there until I went into nursing school. Went to Catholic school and went to nursing school when I was 18 years old, to the same school that my mother went to when she was 18 years old. And my father was an electrical engineer. I had 2 brothers and 3 sisters. So we had a good family. My father was in the Navy in World War I. When I went into nursing school, when I was a probie, Pearl Harbor happened. And they put up a poster in the school office that said, the Navy needs nurses. So every time I went into the office, I saw this poster that said, the Navy needs nurses. In the meantime, both my brothers went in the Navy. And so I said, I might as well go in the Navy when I get finished, if the war's still on. And of course, the war was still on. So I signed up the day after I got out. I went to St. Albans, Long Island, which was like the 3rd largest hospital in the country, a Navy hospital. And they put us through training there. There were about six nurses in my group, and they taught us how to march and go through the rules and regulations and that sort of thing. And that took about 6 weeks, and then they put us to work. We didn't go to boot camp. We got our boot camp where we were going to work. Oh yes, we were taught by a Marine sergeant, and we were not military, and he would take us out and teach us to march. And if somebody made a mistake, they would laugh, and he would get really mad, and he would say, "All right, fall out," and he would walk away and leave us for an hour on the lawn. And that happened very often. So he finally he was a Marine sergeant, and he finally just gave up and let us make stupid fools of ourselves, Then we went right to work. So once they taught us how to march and all this and learn the rules and regs, they put us on duty. And so I went on several different wards until I landed on a ward called B11, which was paraplegics and quads. I was always afraid of B11 because the nurses used to say how hard the patients were because none of them could walk or they were all bedridden. So, and they used to talk about it. So I thought, I really don't want to ever go there. And all of a sudden, on one weekend, on a Saturday, they posted me for a B11, to work on B11. So I walked in the ward, and every person watched every move I made. All day long, they watched me. And that night I said, I really don't want to go back there tomorrow. But I said, I don't have any choice in the matter, so I have to go back. And when I walked in, nobody looked at me. They were sizing me up, I guess. And they nicknamed all the nurses. And you didn't know your nickname, but you heard the other nurses' nicknames because you could hear them discussing them, and they used the nicknames. So one day, I was washing the hair of one of the quads, and he said to me, do you want to know what your nickname is? And I said, are you going to tell me? And he said, well, we're not supposed to, but if you want to know, I'll tell you. So I said, I want to know. He said, Her Majesty's Battle Axe. And I said, what? Her Majesty's battle axe. And he said, HMB. They were my initials. And that became my place. I was there for about 3 years. And that was a life-changing experience, because most of the kids were paraplegics, but also maybe a good third or fourth of them, a third of them maybe were quads and didn't move anything except their face, their head. I realized how difficult it is for some people, for some things. I hadn't come across anybody in my training who was that helpless and who required that much care. And so I just realized that I didn't understand how some people were totally dependent on other people. It was very good for me. We were lucky enough to have that ward got a lot of attention because those kids were so disabled. And so we would have a lot of celebrities come in and entertain them. And that was kind of fun in that ward. So
Fire was a big deal.
yes. And we also, the thing we dreaded the most was a fire. And because those kids couldn't get out of bed by themselves, they couldn't walk. So we all talked about it often. And one day the alarm bell rang and we realized it was our number. And one of the patient's sisters was in the kitchen cooking him some food, like a steak or something, on the stove. And she must have started a little fire in back of the stove. And we heard our number. And I said, oh my goodness, that's my number. There's a fire somewhere here. And all of a sudden, all our worries were for nothing. The corpsmen started streaming through the door to get the patients out of the ward. And we, like 20, kept running into the ward to get them out of the ward. And somebody went in and got the fire out in the kitchen. And we never worried about getting help for that ward again. I had made very good friends with a lot of the nurses. Some of them who worked on B11 with me. And one of them was Ursula Fox, who came from California. And she finally got transferred to Japan. And I was afraid I was going to get transferred to Japan, and I didn't really want to go there. So fortunately, I didn't get transferred there. I kept up with all of them, and they're all gone. They're all gone. During the Korean War, I was at Cherry Point, and it was much easier. I mean, I just had a few wards and not many people as patients. It was a whole different picture than the hospital. I met my husband there. He got transferred there, and he was a OBGYN, and he worked down in the clinic. And after he was there, well, he came right at the same time as the general's ball came around. So he invited me to go to the ball, and so that did it. That did it. We started dating after the ball, and then we both got out the same day. I remember VJ Day because I was on 3 to 11, and I was on a neurosurgical ward. And they announced over the intercom that the ward was over. And in 2 minutes, my ward was empty. And that happened all over the hospital. Everybody, all the patients and corpsmen just vanished. I don't know where they went. I'm assuming they probably all went out to the nearest bar, but I don't know. So it was quite a shock. I wandered around. I tried to call my parents, and I couldn't get any answer at my parents. And my parents were not people who wandered around, you know. And I never found out till the next day that they went to when they went into New York City, which they would never do. So they really decided that they needed to do that. They had my two brothers in the service and me. I learned a lot taking care of the kids. That a lot of them were injured early in the war, especially paraplegics, and they were not complaining about the fact that they got injured early in the war and they were still in the hospital, still being treated. I learned a lot about people. Some of them are very pure as far as the way they treat other people, and others not so much. But there were more good people than bad. I kept up with a lot of those people, a lot of the paraplegics and quads, and it did affect my life. After I left the Navy, I got married. I was in Cherry Point when we decided. My husband came back from Korea, and he was just my boyfriend, And we decided to get married, and we got married and started our family the next year. Even though it sounds strange to think that you can learn a lot about life from going into something like the service. The camaraderie is very interesting. If you want to do something like that, go into the service. Do it, because your life story. You add things to your life story as you go along, and you can do a lot of good in the service. We're the luckiest people in the world, I think, in this country. So, and freedom and democracy is our prime aim, and I think we do it well. My son Jimmy was an English teacher for 40 years. And so every time he came up to visit me, he would bring a recorder and say, "Tell me a story about such and such." And after a long while, he began to write a book. He wrote all these stories in this book. And it says Navy nurse, but he's got everything in here. My parents, my grandparents, everything. It's really a biography. If anybody thinks they're interested in going in the service, it's a great experience.
Hi, Helen. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. How are you?
Good. I'm great. Thank you so much for being with us. It's a huge, huge thrill and honor for me to be able to talk to you. One of the reasons why I love working with friends. It's a very special occasion for all of us. Thank you for sharing that story. Can I ask you, how old are you exactly? I know I'm not supposed to ask any lady that.
99.
I know that you were born in 2023. How old are you exactly?
99.
Oh, okay. When is your birthday?
In May. Excuse me. In May, I'll be 100.
Oh, what day in May?
23rd.
Okay, so after VE Day, just a couple of weeks after VE Day.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about the most formative part of your childhood? What were the things that you remember most vividly now about when you were growing up in America?
The things I remember the most about growing up.
Yeah.
Is that we always went to Catholic school, and for a while we had to walk there, which was a good walk each time, and we all went to the same school. I had brothers and sisters, and we all went to the same school. And the only other thing is that one of my brothers died, and he was a newborn twin and died at age 1 month. it was also the age of the Great Depression. And my mother had to go to the store every day because people, it was very hard to keep up with things like butter and bread. And it was very interesting because the Depression seemed to last for a long time. And while we had the Depression going on, almost every single day, some gentleman would come to the back door. A gentleman would come to the back door and ask my mother for something to eat. And so every day she had somebody sitting on the back porch eating something that she gave him to eat. That's how hard up people were. And my father told her that somebody probably had marked the curb in front of our house so that they knew they could get something to eat there. Interesting.
Do you remember Pearl Harbor? Do you remember where you were when Pearl Harbor occurred?
I certainly do. I was in nursing school when Pearl Harbor happened. I was a probie, and my brothers, both my brothers weren't in the Navy, and they went right. Everybody went at Pearl Harbor. All the guys went into the Navy, and so both my brothers went in, and I was in nursing school, so. Immediately, a poster went up in nursing school saying the Navy needs nurses. Every time I went into the office, I could see that poster. The Navy needs nurses. So that's what I did when I got through.
So when Pearl Harbor happened, you must have been worried about what was going to happen to your brothers because they were both in the Navy.
Yes, yeah? I was worried about that, and they both did fine.
Okay.
They both were on ships and they did fine.
Were they in the Pacific? Where did they serve?
But they both were in the Pacific on different ships.
Okay. When did you first know that you wanted to be a nurse?
I would think I was like 9 years old or 8 or 9 years old. My mother was a nurse.
Right.
And she would point out things to us like never put the top of the sugar down, always turn it upside down. I mean, she was like typical nurse. And I just forgot what I was just telling you.
About your reasons for becoming a nurse.
So every time I went into the office, I saw, I would listen to my mother, and I thought that was the place for me to be a nurse. So I went to the same school that she did. 20 some years later.
Take us back to what it was like to be in the US in early 1942. Pearl Harbor has just happened. America.
When Pearl Harbor happened, one of my, I was a probie in nursing school. One of my classmates had a brother stationed there.
Wow.
And so she was very upset that night. And he was all right. He wasn't killed. So, but a lot of people were killed that day. So, we were all concerned about it, and all the young boys that we went to school with all went into the service. It was Pearl Harbor that drew them in.
Did you think that America was going to win?
I did.
Some people weren't convinced. It wasn't a clear-cut case of we're going to make this. We're going to defeat the Nazis and the Japanese. A lot of Americans didn't have that clear conviction of victory.
I don't know why I thought we were going to win, but I actually did think we were going to win.
What was the first time that you went onto a hospital ward and realized that you were actually dealing with young men who had been very severely damaged by this war? Can you take us back to your first experiences?
Yes. I started on Ward B11 in 1945, and B11 was paraplegics and quads, and most of them were war injuries, but some of them were accidents. And some of the paraplegics could get out of bed with help, but the quads couldn't do anything. They were in fact, they couldn't even feed themselves. So when we it's funny, when we would be dining in the nurses' dining room, people used to talk about their wards, and when people talked about B11, the rest of us used to say, "Oh, gee whiz, I hope I never get there. I never have to go there." And then every Saturday they posted new changes, and so all of a sudden on a Saturday there I was on B11, and I thought, well, maybe it's just a weekend, you know. However, I did the weekend, and as I've said before, the day I walked in, everybody watched every move I made on Saturday. And I thought, oh, this is going to be terrible. Well, the next day was Sunday. And when I walked in, nobody watched anything I did. It was just, they were sizing me up, I guess. And I thought, oh, I'm not sure I want to work in a place like this. And then like less than a week later, I was on the schedule for B11. And I was there for maybe 2 years. And the quads were on strikers. I was there always 3.5 years. I was there. The quads were on strikers, which looked like a little cot that you could turn over, which we used to do so they wouldn't get bed sores. We would turn them on their face and then turn them on their back and turn them on their face. And the quads, so a lot of the quads were on strikers. And one of them, right inside the door, was an 18-year-old kid who had been injured in a football game. And he was a quad. He could move nothing except his head. And every time I walked in through the door, I would say, "Good morning, sweetheart." And he'd say, "Don't call me that." So we'd go about our business. And the next day I'd do the same thing. And after we were all out of the Navy and back home, he called our house one day, and his name was Henry Volpe. We all called him Sweetie after that. And he called our house one day, and my son Jimmy answered the phone, and he said, "This is Henry Volpe." And Jimmy said, "Are you Sweetie?" And he started to cry. So we had great kids there. We lost a lot of them too. We lost, while I was there, maybe 2.5, 3 years maybe. And we lost 3 or 4 of them in that time, all of them quads.
Did you treat young Americans that had literally all of their limbs missing? Did you have a case where there was a young American with no arms and no legs?
No, I didn't have that. But I had kids who were paralyzed enough so they couldn't use their arms or their legs in that ward. That was in the paraplegic ward.
And when you talked to them, how did you give them hope? How did you inspire them to carry on?
Well, a lot of them, they had a lot of visitors from home because they put them closest to home. And so their families were able to come into them. And we treated them as best we could. They had to be fed, which a lot of them just didn't like to be fed by a nurse, you know? And I didn't blame them, but they couldn't feed themselves. So, you did the best you could.
But dealing with quadriplegics and paraplegics, it's a very time-consuming job. It's more than it takes a lot of energy.
Yes.
And I would imagine sometimes it took a lot of your emotional energy.
It did, and we never got off duty. We were supposed to get off duty at 3. We never got off at 3. We were never finished at 3. So we were always overtime getting off duty. But I'll tell you, the people that they had on the ward were really keyed into it, except once in a while they'd get a nurse who didn't like it. And we had one who would just like walk up and down the ward, and not do anything, just walk up and down, and they don't stay. The nurse in charge gets them out of there as quickly as possible. Some people just couldn't do it.
Were there ever times when you cried? Maybe not on the ward, but you went somewhere and cried?
I should say we lost several quads, and one of our boys who was very young was out in the with one of the junior nurses. They went out in a boat at night, and he had braces on his legs. He was the only one in the ward who had learned to walk, and he could walk with the braces, but he didn't have any real power. So he had the leg braces on. So he went out in a boat with one of the young nurses at night for a ride, and he decided to show her if he could swim with braces on his leg. And he got out of the boat, and the boat took him out into the bay, and they never found him.
Wow!
And so everybody was so upset.
Huh.
So
well, that's a
it's terrible.
Incredible. We have a lot of questions here because people really enjoyed your presentation earlier and know how special an occasion it is to be able to talk to you in person. So I'm going to fire away if you don't mind.
All right.
This is from Julie, who's actually a wonderful part of our group because she asks lots of questions. Thank you, Julie. Keep it up. What was the average stay in your ward? What was the average stay in your ward? And a second question, where would they go after their release? So what was the average stay, and where would they go afterwards?
They all stayed. They didn't. We didn't have anybody go home while I was there. And I was on that ward maybe 3 years all total. And nobody went home. We lost some who died, but we didn't have anybody go home. But later on, I know they did because I heard from some of them who went home. So, but their life expectancy was supposed to be a year for a quad and 5 years for a paraplegic. And some of those quads lived 15 years, 20 years.
Why was the life expectancy so low for paraplegics?
For paraplegics, because they couldn't get around. They had to stay in bed and then get help getting out of bed into a wheelchair, and they couldn't walk around. So they just figured it was not good. They were just expressing it. And also they also had a lot of problems with their kidneys.
Right. Another question here from Robin. Can you share how you processed and dealt with healing from your own experience? Because this must have been quite traumatic for you. How did you deal with the experience?
It really wasn't traumatic because there were several of us on that ward, like 4 nurses in the daytime. And one of them was a good friend of mine, and she was a master. And it was we dealt with it. We had a couple of patients who were depressed, quads, that couldn't get out of bed. And we kept trying to improve their mood, which we never succeeded in doing. But I enjoyed that ward. I was there a while. And my friend also enjoyed it.
What did you learn about human nature? What was the biggest lesson you learned about human nature?
And that some people are very patient, especially if they're inconvenienced, like somebody who's a paraplegic or a quad. They're very patient because we had to feed all the quads. and we couldn't. We had to feed them one at a time. You know, there were three of us, but we had a lot of quads, so it takes a lot of patience. And they had patience, and they just didn't complain. Even some of them smoked cigarettes, and so we would sometimes go over and put a cigarette in their mouth and light it, let them light it, and then hold it for them while they would smoke the cigarette. Which used to, when I would do that, it was such a busy ward that I would try to control myself to not be impatient, and then I'd sit there and hold the cigarette. I never smoked myself, but I would hold the cigarette until they motioned that they wanted a new puff.
Did you wait till they'd finished the cigarette? Did you have to wait?
Yes, I would sit there till they finished the cigarette.
Did you ever say, "Come on, take more drags, hurry up"?
No, I don't think so.
Gosh, imagine today that would know. Oh my God, a whole different. Oh my God.
Yes.
Anyway, well, I was looking at photographs of you, and I actually did buy your book, by the way. And
thanks. How nice.
My honor. And I looked at some photographs, and I have to say that you guys were you just look so beautiful. You were so beautiful. You still are, but you look so beautiful.
Thank you.
Did you have a problem with these young men who, you know, they really didn't have, some of them didn't have any reason to hope, or there was no life ahead of them? I'm sure they all must have thought of you as angels, and they must have fallen in love with you. Did you have problems with all these guys falling in love with you?
No, they were all bedridden. There was nothing they could do. I mean, but some of them stayed friends the rest of their lives after they left.
Right. Wow.
Particularly two of them.
Can you tell me about your fiance? Your fiance, the gentleman who was a Marine, and
George. You mean George?
Yes.
George was a pilot, a Marine pilot, and he came to St. Albans, and I was a daily masser, and so all of a sudden he was sitting in the front pew every day at mass. So I went in and asked the priest who he was. And when he told me his name, I said, "Oh, I think I'll marry him." And my friends were laughing on the floor, falling on the floor laughing. They thought that was so silly for me to say. 6 months later, I was engaged to him. and he walked up to me in the PX and said, "Are you Miss Barry?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Oh, I wondered if you'd go to the movies with me sometime." 6 months later, we were engaged, but he had cancer, and he was there because there was a big cancer hospital in New York, and they were sending him over there. But the cancer finally got him.
So you met a gentleman knowing that he had cancer, and you still married him. You still wanted to get married to him. Sorry.
Oh yes, because I thought they would be able to get it. You know, they didn't know as much about cancer in those days as they do now. That was a long time ago.
Well, that's a beautiful faith you had. A wonderful faith.
He was a really nice guy.
What was the movie that you watched? Do you remember the first movie that you watched together?
Oh gosh, I'll never remember. I'll never remember the movie.
So tell me about the end of the war. Where were you when the war? Where exactly were you when the war ended? Were you actually working? Were you on the ward when the war ended?
I was on the ward, yes, at St. Albans when the war ended, and they announced it over the intercom. And in 2 minutes, the entire ward was empty. Everybody, even the corpsmen, everybody was gone. I was all by myself in a few minutes. I think it happened probably all over the hospital. That people, I don't know why they went. Maybe they went out to get a drink, or I don't know what they did, but I was all by myself. And I tried to call my parents at home, and they were gone. And my parents were not people who would go wandering around. They went into New York City, which is very unusual for them. It was a big day.
One of the happiest days of your life?
One of the happiest days of my life.
Lovely question here from Marvin Williams. And he says, Helen, I very much enjoyed your talk. Often overlooked by many is that you and all the other nurses enlisted to serve your country and signed up for the duration of the war, not knowing where you would be stationed. And he says, my mother was a World War II evacuation hospital nurse, and your story is special to me.
Oh, how nice.
Yeah, and he says, thank you for your service. So that's from Marvin Williams.
How nice.
Yeah, we have some lovely people listening to you right now.
Amazing.
Julie again asks, what was the favorite type of entertainment of the soldiers?
Oh, I'll tell you, there were some entertainers, people who played music or sang, and they would come into the ward and stay for a couple of hours and ask the boys for what songs they wanted. And that went on all the time, all over the hospital. Because we were right near New York, so that was pretty nice. We were at Long Island, was not that far from the city.
I have a quick question. During World War II, if you met someone and you really liked them, and they were wearing a uniform, you were wearing a uniform, and the gentleman was wearing a uniform. If you met someone and you fell in love with them, wasn't there an enormous sense of like, we might only have so much time. We might only have a week or a month or a weekend even. Was everything accelerated? Everything was very intense and sped up, yeah?
I never had that impression because I was at St. Albans for maybe 4 or 5 years, 4 years. And then I went to Cherry Point, Marine Corps Air Station, and I think I was there 3 years. So I just never had that.
My point is that a lot of people got married very quickly because there was a war on.
Yes, but I wasn't interested. I liked the Navy. If I hadn't gotten married, I probably would have stayed in for 20 years.
Really?
Yeah, I really liked it.
So tell us about your husband. You met him obviously while you were working.
Oh yes, he came to Cherry Point while I was working there. He was a flight surgeon, and they were preparing to send him to Korea. Cherry Point Marine Corps Air Station. That's what it was. Marine Corps Air Station, and he did go to Korea. They sent him to Korea, and he was there for I think a year. And when he came back, we got married. We corresponded the whole year, and when he came back, we got married.
How long were you guys married for?
50 years. 50 years and 8 children.
My goodness, 8 children.
8 children.
How on earth did you manage to have 8 children? I have 1 child. How did you manage 8?
It was easy, I'll tell you. It was. They're such good kids. I had really good kids.
How can you possibly say it was easy? 8 children. How did you have lots of help? Did you have family members around?
No, but they, they went to school every day, so I had some help, but not much. But they went to school every day and went by school bus.
And where was that? Where did you bring up your family?
In West Springfield, Massachusetts.
Okay. Our executive Our executive director, Holly Rotundi, she's from Boston, so
Oh.
she'll like the sound of that,
Oh,
Massachusetts.
yes. We were 50 miles from Boston, right? Yes.
Where are you now? Where do you live now?
I live in Maine now. This was our summer house. And so when my husband retired, we moved back up here. We moved up here away from our house down there.
Okay, I have a couple more questions here. Julie again, and I'm going to allow her to have yet another question because they're always good. She says, tell us more about your nickname, because that's kind of it's a severe nickname, HMS. Sorry,
Her Majesty's Battle Axe. I was shocked when he told me, because I thought they liked me, and I was shocked when he told me, so I said to him, Her Majesty's Battle Axe, and he said HMB, my initials. One of the girls' name was Messier, and they called her Messy Bessie. They nicknamed all of us.
So you weren't at all strict then. You weren't strict on the ward. That's
no. Especially you wouldn't be strict on paraplegics and quads.
Right.
They needed as much kindness as they could get.
How did you keep finding that kindness? Every day you had to go and give and give and give. How did you find that? Where did you find that kindness from?
Well, I just loved that ward, and everybody was afraid of it. And I was afraid of it until I went there. And when I realized what a nice bunch of kids they were, and most of them, I mean, at least a half of them or more were quads, helpless, had to be fed. And I was delighted to be there. And I think I held the record for being there the longest.
Did you used to pray with them? Were they?
No, I didn't pray with them. I used to pray for them, but I didn't pray with them. But I used to pay attention to them and hold cigarettes. And if I thought they were depressed, I would sit and talk to them. They were really a good bunch of kids.
Another question here. Statement rather, from Paul. Thank you so much for your service. I think we all want to say that.
Oh my.
And he says, my father was in the Navy on a sub chaser. He was admitted to St. Albans in a separate ward in 1944 for a short time. He never spoke about it, so I do not know why. But see what connections you're forming here? There's someone
My goodness. Well, I was at St. Albans for 5 years, maybe 4 years, 4 or 5. 1945.
So we have a couple more questions here. They're coming in thick and fast now, thankfully. Did Helen ever work with her physician husband in his practice? Or perhaps you were too busy cooking for 8 children and 2 adults?
I was never even in his office. Never went into his office.
Right. Another question here from Gary. Who were some of the celebrities that visited the wards at St. Albans while you were there? Any memorable ones? Anybody that you remember?
Yes, Johnny Desmond.
Who was he? I'm like, who was Johnny Desmond? What was his? What did
Johnny
he do?
Redmond. Johnny Redmond.
Redmond,
not Desmond. And let's see, who else did we have? Eddie Mack and Johnny Redmond would come into the wards and sing to the kids, ask them their name, and Johnny Redmond could make up a song with somebody's name.
How many grandchildren do you have?
5.
And
12.
how many?
12.
You have 12 grandchildren.
I have 12 grandchildren. I have 8 children.
Right.
And 12 grandchildren.
And great grandchildren?
Great-grandchildren, 4,
Wow.
7.
7. Do you write Christmas cards to all of them? Do you send them all Christmas presents?
I used to, but not anymore. This year I didn't do it. Huh? Birthday,
How are you going to?
They
how
get
are you going
birthday
to-
cards. They get birthday cards.
Oh, that's good. You must have a very long list of dates in your diary to
I do.
remind you of all those.
I do.
How are you going to celebrate your 100th birthday?
My goodness, I hope not too wildly. I hope it's going to be kind of quiet. I can't believe I'm going to make 100. Nobody in my family did.
What is the secret to your long life?
I have no idea. I had rheumatic fever with heart disease when I was in the Navy at Cherry Point. And they put me in the hospital in Philadelphia, Naval Hospital, and the doctor told me my life expectancy was about 20 years. And that was in oh my goodness, 48. That was a long time ago.
How
1951.
Oh, wow.
Long time ago.
How important is your faith to your life? How important has your faith been in your life?
Before I got so old, I was a daily masser. I went to mass every morning. And I did that from the time I was in high school.
Would you still go to mass every day if you could?
I would, but I can't.
Right.
I can't drive anymore. And I can't drive anymore. And somebody would have to take me and go and get me. But I watch it on TV.
You are. Everyone's saying, my goodness, everyone is saying that you're utterly amazing because you are. And then, question here: is the quilt behind you? Did you make the quilt that's behind you?
Oh no,
No.
It's a quilt of valor. It's a quilt of valor. Jimmy says.
Okay.
Presented from Joy.
Presented by Joy.
Yes.
Presented by Joy.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
I just have to say one thing that you're very sharp. You have your wit. You have all your wits about you. You're very quick and sharp. I'm very impressed. And on that note, Susan Yu, her surname is spelled Y-U. She says to you, Helen, you are amazing. So you have another person there saying you're amazing. Julie Ornelas says, my grandmother is also 99. You both have some amazing stories. And then another question here from Gary Lane. When looking back, what did the United States Navy do for you, and how did that affect you for the rest of your life? So basically, what did the US Navy do for you, and how did that change your life?
Well, the Navy was big in our family because my father was in the Navy in World War I, and when I went in, both my brothers were already in. So I was like a latecomer. But the Navy was a really I would not have wanted to miss it. It was very interesting. And I probably would have stayed, if I didn't get married, I probably would have stayed in for 20 years.
Why did you enjoy it so much? Why was it so enjoyable?
Well, it was different from nursing in the hospital. I mean, it was just, we'd have the same ward for a certain period of time, and then you'd go on night duty, and then you'd go back to another ward. It was just like, it was interesting. You had new people to learn and new things to learn. And it was very interesting. I enjoyed it.
Do you have anybody in your life now that served with you? Any friends still, or any?
They're all gone.
Wow.
They're all gone. None of them lived to be 99.
How does that feel to be the last one left?
I'm the last one in my family also. I'm not sure I like it. I wish I wasn't the last one.
When you look back on World War II, is your service the period of your life that you're proudest of? Are you most proud of that?
I'm proud of it, but I was also proud of being a nurse. I really enjoyed being a nurse all those years. I think it wasn't the most, but I enjoy. I'm glad I did it. I'm glad I did it.
Do you feel like you belong to the greatest generation? How do you react when people say that you are a member of the greatest generation?
Well, I enjoyed it. I mean, I just enjoyed being a member of that generation. And I really didn't contribute to it so much. It contributed to me.
Wow. Yeah. Question here, another question. And this is a really important question because it's at the heart of our mission at Friends. What advice would you give young people today?
About going in the service?
Any kind of advice. If you went into a high school classroom, as I'm about to do this week, and you stood in front of 17 and 18-year-olds, what would you tell them? What would be the thing that you would tell them?
Ooh.
There may be several things, but what would you like to tell them about being an American?
Do what you can for your country and also for yourself.
Is it important to serve others? Is it important to serve other people?
Definitely important to serve others. You get the most consolation from serving other people.
Have we lost that notion of public service? It seems to us who are of a younger generation that your generation were much more prepared to serve, that you guys didn't think twice about serving your country or others. Have we lost that sense of service, perhaps?
Oh, I hope not. I hope not. When in my day, when I went in the service, I mean, all my friends from high school were already in, all the boys, and my brothers were both in. My father was in World War I. It just seemed like the natural thing to do.
Can I ask you one final question?
Sure.
What message would you like to give to young people about World War II? Why was it so important that we win World War II? Why was it such an important event in United States history?
Well, we couldn't afford not to win. I don't know how to tell you how important it was, but we couldn't afford not to win. We had to win World War II because our life our everyday life would not be the same. Our lives would be quite different, I would say, and maybe we might even be under somebody else's rule.
Have you ever seen America more united than in World War II?
I don't think I have. They were very united in World War II.
Tell us a little bit about that. We have to unfortunately wrap up soon. I could talk to you all day. But just tell us, leave us with some thoughts about just how united this country was in World War II.
You know, this country was united in World War II because everybody was looking out for everybody else. I mean, even if you walked along the street in World War II, if another serviceman passed you, they would salute you. Didn't even know you. They would salute you. It was just like everybody was working toward a single goal. And that goal was to get through with the war and to win it and to go ahead with our lives.
Well, I have to say that you did a fantastic job, and thank goodness you did win it. Thank goodness.
Thank goodness.
Thank you.
I didn't win it, but thank goodness the people who fought it won it.
I always say that we can't thank you enough. And we all know that there are very few of you from the 16 million who served in World War II still alive. And it's such a great honor for us to be able to talk to you today and share your story with others. I thank you from the bottom of my heart. I'm a huge fan of any nurse, but you did an amazing job in World War II. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
I just wanted to say that we have had a really, really strong reaction to your talk. Everybody has been spellbound. I have, and the comments coming up are, it was great to listen to Helen's story. Thanks for sharing it with us. And I think all of us would like to say one thing before I end. We wish you a very happy 100th birthday.
Thank you.
Very happy one.
Thank you.
Gary Lane says on that note, you are a superstar of the greatest generation.
Oh my goodness.
Absolutely. And then he says, fair winds and following seas, which I know is a Navy term.
Yes, that's right.
But anyway, on behalf of Holly Rotundi, Max Accioni, who's our technical wizard, really is a technical wizard, and everybody else at Friends of the World War II Memorial, I just want to say, Helen, thank you so much for your time. It's been a really beautiful experience getting to talk and listen to you. It's a wonderful privilege. Thank you so much, and we wish you all the very best. And to everybody else,
thank you too, and thank you too.
Our pleasure. And to everybody else who's still with us, please join us next month, because we have another great 3 hours with some really wonderful guests. So thank you. Have a wonderful rest of your weekend. And Helen, you're the best.
Thank you very much.
The angel of angels. Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks for a great lineup today. We hope you will join us next month, March 18th. That will be our last session for this season, and then we'll start back up in October. But all those educators who are online, please make sure to check out our teachers conference this July. It's July 17th to 21st. And we hope you'll be here. Come and join us in DC for what should be a great experience. Many thanks to our fantastic lineup of presenters today. Samuel, Norm, it's always a great pleasure to see you. And I'm so appreciative to all the stories you've shared with us over the years and contributing to our efforts to teach the lessons of yesterday to unite the generations of tomorrow. And Mrs. Siragusa, oh my goodness, wow, that was a fantastic. As a fellow Massachusetts person, I'm very proud to have been able to share this afternoon with you. Thank you so much. It's just an absolute pleasure and honor. And we'll be online for a little while. If anybody has any questions you want to write in the chat, I'm happy to answer. But please do join us back here next month. Take care, everyone.